This is Chapter 6 of The Americans, A New Industrial Age. Chapter 6 covers the time period of 1870 through 1900. The major questions for Chapter 6 of The Americans are: what are the pros and cons of railroad expansion? What dangers do the railroad workers encounter? How will businesses and the general public benefit from the Transcontinental Railroad? How might railroad construction affect the environment? On page 230, you'll see the beginning of Chapter 6, Section 1, the expansion of industry. The main idea for this section is, at the end of the 19th century, natural resources, creative ideas, and growing markets fueled an industrial boom. You'll read in this section about how the discovery of oil was a major feature of this time period, and as you probably can tell, has radically transformed our society. Oil has been called black gold, and the process for getting oil out of the ground was pioneered by Edwin L. Drake, who used a steam engine to drill for oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania. In addition to the discovery of oil, the refinement of iron into steel was made possible by the Bessemer process, which was invented by Henry Bessemer and the American ironmaker William Kelly. Take a moment to look at the map at the bottom of page 231, showing the development of the steel industry in the city of Pittsburgh between the year 1886 and 1906. The map is interesting because it shows how many steel mills were inside the city limits in 1886 and just how many more were built in that 20-year time period. What's also interesting is to notice how many steel mills were built outside of the city limits by 1906. This shows that business leaders in the steel industry realized that they could take advantage of the resources of the area without paying taxes or being under the political control of the local city. All they had to do was relocate their steel mills to the outskirts of the city, thereby employing the local people and avoiding local taxes and political control. On page 232, you'll see new uses for steel. Obviously, new railroads used an enormous amount of steel for the trains, the tracks, and all of the associated industries. However, steel was also used to create new architectural items like the Brooklyn Bridge and the first skyscraper, which was built in Chicago. It was the Home Insurance Building. One of the most important inventions of the 19th century is, of course, the power of electricity, which was developed and brought into cities and homes by Thomas Alva Edison. The development of electricity, of course, allowed for people to change the way they lived their daily lives, adding more hours to the working day as well as to socializing in the evenings. On page 233, you'll also notice other inventions that affected the way people lived, and this is, of course, the invention of the typewriter by Christopher Sholes and of the dramatic invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson. The invention of the typewriter allowed for new jobs to be created that employed primarily women for the first time. In addition to the typewriter, the telephone also created new jobs as telephone operators. At the bottom of page 233, you'll see the vocabulary for Chapter 6, Section 1. Please make vocabulary cards to help you study. Chapter 6, Section 2, the Age of the Railroads. The main idea of this section is that the growth and consolidation of railroads benefited the nation, but also led to corruption and required government regulation. Here you'll read about one American's story in the town of Pullman, Illinois. Pullman, Illinois was named after the industrialist George M. Pullman, who had designed a railroad car factory and built the town to house his growing number of workers. This is an interesting example of the power and the abuses of the Industrial Revolution, Because while George M. Pullman was producing railroad cars and making an enormous fortune for himself, he also was a tyrant lording over the town of Pullman, Illinois, with restrictions upon its residents that they had to obey or they'd lose their job and their home. The development of the railroad reaches its peak in 1869 with the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, for the first time, Americans can travel by train across the country, a journey that had typically taken months, if not most of a year, to complete, could now be done in a matter of weeks. The railroads were built primarily by immigrants and out-of-work Civil War veterans who died from diseases and accidents in large numbers with no protection or benefit from the railroads. By linking previously isolated cities, towns, and settlements, the railroads promoted trade and interdependence. Cities like Chicago and Minneapolis became major centers for industry and agriculture. This gave an enormous amount of power to the owners of the railroads because they literally could decide the life and death of a city based upon whether their train went to that city. Another example of the corrupting influence of this new industrialization is the example of Credit Mobilier, which you'll read about here. The Credit Mobilier scandal erupted when the Union Pacific Railroad created a fake company, the Credit Mobilier Company. This company was set up to build the tracks for the railroad, and in order to do so, it received contracts from the federal government. These contracts were abusive because they charged the federal government 2 to 3 times the actual costs and then pocketed the profits for the Credit Mobilier Company and the Union Pacific Railroad. To get away with this obvious fraud, the Credit Mobilier Company gave shares of stock to about 20 representatives in Congress, essentially bribing them to look the other way while this private company robbed the American taxpayer. The investigation into the Credit Mobilier scandal ultimately revealed that many prominent politicians had received millions of dollars in stocks, bonds, and cash in exchange for ripping off the American public. In fact, Congressman James Garfield, who would later become president, was shown to have personally profited at taxpayer expense. We might expect that this obvious corruption would end his career in politics. However, little more than a slap on the wrist was given as the punishment for robbing the American taxpayer. We have to ask ourselves, is the American worker better off under industrialized capitalism than under slavery? Also, we need to ask ourselves about the Credit Mobilier scandal, just how democratic the United States is under industrialized capitalism. On page 238, you'll see the response to the corruption of industrialized capitalism, the Grange and the railroads. Farmers were disturbed by what they saw as openly corrupt government and the increasingly abusive power of the railroads, and they responded by founding an organization known as the Grange, which demanded government control over the railroad industry. The Grange identified abuses by the railroads in terms of the misuse of land that had been given by the government and was sold to other businesses rather than settlers. Also, the Grange identified formal agreements between railroads to fix prices, which helped to keep farmers in debt. The Grange sought to pass laws that would stop the railroads from keeping the farmers deeply in debt. And these laws were challenged in the case of Munn v. Illinois. The Supreme Court upheld these laws, and the federal government established the right to regulate private industry to serve the public interest. When we consider the outcome of the case of Munn v. Illinois, we have to ask ourselves whether or not the federal government should regulate private industry to serve public interest. Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which established the right of the federal government to supervise railroad activities, and it created the Interstate Commerce Commission for that purpose. The impact of the Granger laws and the Interstate Commerce Act are examples of just how difficult it was for the American people to control industrialized capitalism. Because while the commission to regulate the railroads came into existence in 1897, it wasn't until 1906 that it actually was used to regulate railroad rates. The railroads were able to manipulate Congress into preventing their regulation. And they did this through corrupt bribes and money in politics. Because the Interstate Commerce Commission had almost no effect for a decade after it was first created, we have to ask ourselves whether or not democracy can truly control industrialized capitalism. The industrialists were so wealthy that they were able to bribe politicians to do what they wanted, rather than allowing the politicians to serve the needs of the American people. Chapter 6, Section 2 ends with the vocabulary on page 240. Please add these terms to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards.